Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of my podcast. This is Lilly, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here with me today. I've been looking forward to recording this episode because the topic we're covering is something that's been incredibly meaningful in my own life, and I know it will resonate with many of you as well. And before we continue, if you're enjoying these podcast-style English learning episodes, make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out our podcast playlist for many more videos filled with real conversations, listening practice, confidence-building tips, and practical English you can use in everyday life. If you're new to the podcast, let me tell you a little bit about what we do here. Every single week, we dive deep into topics that matter to real people living real lives. We talk about personal growth, overcoming challenges, building confidence, and creating meaningful connections with the world around us. Today, we're going to focus specifically on something that I believe is foundational to all of those things: the ability to communicate effectively and express yourself with genuine confidence. Now, I want to be honest with you right from the start. A few years ago, I was not a confident communicator. I would stumble over my words, second-guess myself mid-sentence, and often find myself thinking in my native language and then trying to translate what I wanted to say into English. It was exhausting, frustrating, and it held me back from so many opportunities. But through years of intentional practice, reflection, and genuine effort, I've completely transformed my relationship with communication, and I'm here to share that journey with you. The beautiful thing about communication is that it's not some innate talent that you either have or you don't. It's a skill, and like all skills, it can be learned, developed, and mastered through consistent practice and the right approach. Throughout this episode, I'm going to share with you practical strategies, real-life examples, and actionable exercises that have genuinely changed the way I communicate and the way I think about language itself. Also, if you want even more episodes like this one after you're done listening, don't forget to explore the podcast playlist because there are plenty of additional conversations and lessons waiting for you there to help improve your English naturally and confidently. Before we dive into the heart of this discussion, I want to invite you to do something for me. As you listen to this episode, I want you to think about your own communication challenges. Maybe you struggle with public speaking. Maybe you're learning a new language and feel frustrated with your progress. Maybe you want to feel more confident in professional settings. Or perhaps you just want to express yourself more authentically in everyday conversations. Whatever your situation is, I want you to know that you're not alone, and the insights we're going to explore today can absolutely help you. Let's start with something fundamental. Communication isn't really about the words themselves, is it? When you think about the people who communicate most effectively, they're not necessarily the ones with the biggest vocabulary or the perfect grammar. They're the people who have learned to think clearly, organize their thoughts coherently, and express those thoughts in a way that resonates with others. That's the real magic of communication. When I was struggling with my own communication skills, I made a discovery that changed everything. I realized I was spending so much mental energy on the mechanics of language that I wasn't actually thinking clearly about what I wanted to communicate. It was like trying to write a beautiful letter while simultaneously worrying about every grammatical rule. The result was something that felt stiff, unnatural, and honestly, a bit painful to listen to. Here's what I learned. True fluency in communication comes from aligning your thinking with your speaking. You need to train your mind to work in the language you're speaking, not translate from one language to another. This is such an important concept, and I want to spend some time exploring it with you because it's going to form the foundation for everything else we discuss today. When you rely on translation, several things happen. First, your brain is working twice as hard. You're thinking in one language, translating to another, and then speaking. That process introduces delays, and those delays often result in communication that feels hesitant or awkward. Second, you lose the nuance of what you're trying to say. Translation is never perfect, and something always gets lost or changed in that process. Third, and perhaps most importantly, you're not building actual fluency. You're building a crutch, and crutches, while helpful in the short term, prevent you from ever walking on your own. So, how do you break this cycle? The answer is simpler than you might think, but it does require commitment and intentional practice. You start by training your brain to think directly in the language you want to speak, and you start small. You don't need to think about complex philosophical concepts or detailed descriptions of abstract ideas. You start with your immediate surroundings and your immediate experiences. Let me give you an example from my own life. When I first decided to make this shift, I started narrating my morning routine to myself entirely in English. Every single morning, without fail, I would wake up and immediately start describing what I was doing, out loud, in complete sentences. I would say things like, "I'm opening my eyes now. The sunlight is coming through the window. My bedroom is quite warm this morning. I'm stretching my arms and legs because my muscles feel tight. I'm getting out of bed carefully because I'm still a little drowsy." Now, I know that might sound a bit silly, and honestly, at first, it felt awkward, but something remarkable happened. The more I did this, the more natural it became. My brain started making connections between my actions and the English language directly. I wasn't translating anymore. I was simply thinking in English and expressing those thoughts out loud. And the beautiful part? This ability started to extend to other areas of my life. The reason this technique works is rooted in neuroscience. When you repeat an action over and over again, your brain creates neural pathways that make that action easier and more automatic. The same principle applies to language. When you consistently think and speak in English about your immediate experiences, your brain literally rewires itself to process language differently. You're building new neural pathways that bypass translation entirely. I want to emphasize something really important here. This is not about memorizing phrases or drilling grammar rules. This is about creating a genuine shift in how your brain processes information. It's about moving from a place of conscious, effortful thinking to a place where communication becomes more natural and automatic. And that shift absolutely can happen for you, just like it happened for me. Now, I want to shift our focus a little bit and talk about something that's deeply connected to fluency and clear communication: confidence. Because here's the truth, and I say this from experience, you can have perfect grammar and an impressive vocabulary, but if you're not confident, it won't matter. Your communication will still feel tentative and uncertain. Confidence is like a foundation for everything else. It's the thing that allows you to actually use the skills you've developed. And the interesting thing is that confidence isn't something you're born with, it's something you build. Every single time you communicate, especially when you feel a bit nervous or uncertain and you push through anyway, you're building confidence. You're sending a message to your brain that says, "I can do this. I've done it before, and I can do it again." I want to tell you about a shift in perspective that completely changed my relationship with making mistakes. For a long time, I was terrified of making mistakes when I spoke. I would stay silent rather than risk saying something wrong. I would second-guess myself constantly. And do you know what that accomplished? Absolutely nothing positive. It just made me more anxious and less confident. Then I had a realization that came from watching children learn language. Have you ever noticed how children learning to speak don't really worry about making mistakes? They just keep talking and trying and experimenting. They say things in funny ways, they mispronounce words, they get grammar wrong, and nobody expects them to be perfect. And because of that freedom, they learn incredibly quickly. They're not inhibited by fear of judgment. I decided I needed to adopt that same mindset. I decided that mistakes weren't failures. They were learning opportunities. They were evidence that I was pushing myself and challenging myself to grow. And you know what? That shift in perspective completely changed everything. Suddenly, I was willing to take risks in my communication. I would try new vocabulary, attempt more complex sentence structures, and engage in conversations that pushed me outside my comfort zone. What I discovered was that most people are far more forgiving of mistakes than we think they are. If you mispronounce a word or use a slightly incorrect grammatical structure, most people either don't notice or they understand your meaning despite the error. And the few times when someone does point out a mistake, that's actually valuable feedback. That's you learning and improving in real time. Confidence also comes from preparation, and this is something I want to talk about at length because it's such a practical and powerful tool. When you know you might encounter a certain situation and you've thought through what you might say, you approach that situation with more confidence. Your brain feels less overwhelmed because you've already done some of the thinking ahead of time. For instance, when I was working on improving my communication in professional settings, I started preparing for meetings in a different way. Rather than just preparing the technical content, I also prepared the language I would use. I would think through the questions I might be asked, and I would mentally rehearse how I would answer them. I would prepare key phrases that I wanted to use. I would even practice the tone and pace of how I wanted to deliver information. This preparation doesn't mean you're not being authentic or spontaneous. It means you're giving yourself the gift of confidence. You're reducing the cognitive load on your brain during the actual conversation, which means you can be more present, more attentive to the other person, and more able to respond in a thoughtful way rather than just scrambling to figure out what to say. Fluency is this word that gets thrown around a lot. And I think sometimes people have unrealistic expectations about what it means. Let me tell you what fluency really is, based on my own experience and my observations of truly fluent communicators. Fluency is not about speaking quickly. It's not about never pausing or never searching for a word. Fluency is about your ability to express your ideas clearly, to sustain a conversation naturally, and to recover gracefully when you don't know something. A truly fluent communicator is someone who can pause thoughtfully and say, "Let me think about how to express that." A fluent communicator is someone who can say, "I'm not sure about that word, but what I mean is..." A fluent communicator is someone who can adapt their communication style based on their audience and the situation. These are the real markers of fluency, not the ability to speak without pausing or without ever searching for a word. When I was working on developing my own fluency, I made a conscious decision to stop being afraid of pauses and silence. In fact, I started to embrace them. I realized that pauses are powerful. A pause gives your brain time to formulate your next thought. A pause makes your message more powerful because it builds anticipation. A pause shows that you're thinking carefully about what you want to say. Pauses are not weakness. They're actually a sign of confident, thoughtful communication. I want to walk you through some of the key building blocks of fluency because understanding these will help you develop your own fluency more intentionally. The first building block is pattern recognition and pattern use. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines. We naturally look for patterns in the things we encounter. Language is full of patterns, phrases that occur together, grammatical structures that combine in certain ways, conversational patterns that repeat across different contexts. When you're listening to language, even if you don't consciously realize it, your brain is absorbing these patterns. And when you speak, you're accessing those patterns that you've internalized. So one of the most effective ways to build fluency is to expose yourself to lots of language patterns, to notice them, and to consciously practice using them. For example, There are certain ways that English speakers typically start sentences. They might say, "I think that," or "in my opinion," or "from what I understand." There are certain ways they typically express uncertainty. "I'm not entirely sure, but," or "I could be wrong, but," or "based on what I know." There are certain ways they connect ideas, "because of that," or "as a result," or "on the other hand." When you've heard these patterns repeatedly and when you've practiced using them, they become part of your automatic repertoire. The second building block of fluency is vocabulary in context. Now, I need to be clear about something here. You don't need to know every word. You don't need a massive vocabulary to be fluent. What you need is deep familiarity with the words and phrases you use most often. You need to know them so well that you can access them quickly and use them naturally in different contexts. When I decided to focus on building my vocabulary more intentionally, I didn't try to memorize long word lists. Instead, I chose specific topics that were relevant to my life and my work, and I built my vocabulary around those topics. For example, if I was working in a professional setting that involved data analysis, I would learn vocabulary related to data analysis. Not just learn the words, but learn how they're used in real conversations and real contexts. I would listen to how people in that field talked about their work. I would read articles and documents in that field. I would practice using that vocabulary in sentences. The result was that I could speak about topics that mattered to me with increasing confidence and fluency. And here's something interesting. Once I had built fluency in one topic area, it became easier to build fluency in other areas. The skills transferred. I became better at recognizing patterns, better at making connections between new vocabulary and things I already knew, better at using new language naturally. The third building block is listening with intention. Most people hear language passively. They listen to English, but they're not really paying attention to how it's constructed, how it flows, how different elements fit together. When I consciously shifted to active listening, everything changed. I started paying attention to things like the rhythm of speech, the intonation, the pace, the way speakers link ideas together, the way they recover when they stumble over words. I would listen to podcasts, watch videos, listen to conversations, and I would literally try to absorb the patterns. Sometimes I would pause and repeat what I heard, trying to replicate the same intonation and rhythm. This kind of active listening is incredibly powerful for developing fluency because you're not just passively absorbing information, you're actively engaging with how language works. Now I want to shift into something that's really going to help you practically. I want to give you specific strategies and techniques that you can implement starting today, right now, to improve your communication and build your confidence. These aren't complicated strategies, but they are powerful when you commit to them consistently. The first strategy I want to talk about is what I call internal narration. I mentioned this earlier, but I want to give you more detail about how to do it and why it's so effective. The idea is simple. Throughout your day, you narrate what you're doing, what you're seeing, what you're thinking, all in the language you're trying to develop fluency in. And you do this silently in your mind, or if you're in a private space, out loud. The beauty of internal narration is that it's always available to you. You can do it while you're waiting for a bus, while you're walking somewhere, while you're doing household chores, while you're having a shower. You don't need a conversation partner. You don't need a classroom. You just need to direct your attention to narrating your experience. When I do internal narration, I try to be specific and descriptive. Rather than just thinking, "I'm making breakfast," I think or say something like, "I'm opening the refrigerator. The cold air is coming out. I'm looking for eggs. I can see a carton on the second shelf. I'm taking them out. They feel smooth and cool in my hand. I'm walking over to the stove." This kind of specific, detailed narration does so many things. It builds your vocabulary. It helps you practice forming complete sentences. It trains your brain to think directly in the language. The second strategy is what I call situational preparation. This is where you identify situations that you encounter regularly or situations that make you nervous, and you prepare language for them ahead of time. Maybe you're nervous about phone calls. Maybe you're nervous about job interviews. Maybe you're nervous about social situations where you know you'll need to engage in conversation. Whatever the situation is, you prepare. Preparation means thinking through what might happen in that situation, what you might want to say, what questions you might be asked, and how you would answer those questions. You're not memorizing scripts. You're just doing the thinking ahead of time so that when the actual situation occurs, your brain doesn't feel overwhelmed. There's already been some processing that's happened. For example, when I was preparing for a professional presentation that I knew would be in English, I didn't just prepare the slides and the content, I also prepared my introduction. I practiced how I would greet the audience, how I would introduce myself, how I would frame the topic. I thought about the kinds of questions I might be asked and how I would respond to them. I even thought about how I would handle if I didn't know the answer to a question. All of this preparation meant that when I actually gave the presentation, I was confident. I could focus on connecting with my audience rather than scrambling to figure out what to say. The third strategy is phrase banking. This is where you collect phrases that are useful and versatile and that you want to have at your disposal. These are like mental tools that you can pull out when you need them. I have a specific collection of phrases that I use regularly, and I know them so well that they come out automatically when I'm speaking. For example, I have phrases I use when I need to buy time. That's an interesting question. Let me think about that for a moment. I have phrases I use when I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure about that, but based on what I know, I have phrases I use when I want to express agreement. I think you make an excellent point. I have phrases I use when I want to express disagreement respectfully. I see where you're coming from, and I appreciate that perspective, but I would say, when you build a repertoire of these kinds of phrases, you're not limiting yourself. You're actually freeing yourself. Because you have these tools at your disposal, you can focus on the bigger picture of the conversation rather than getting stuck searching for words. You can be more spontaneous and natural because you're not starting from zero every time you speak. The fourth strategy is shadowing and repetition. Shadowing is where you listen to a piece of language and you try to repeat it immediately after, matching the pronunciation, the intonation, the pace as closely as possible. When I was working on developing more natural-sounding English, I used shadowing extensively. I would listen to podcasts or videos or recordings, and I would repeat after the speaker, trying to sound just like them. This technique is powerful because you're not just hearing language, you're actively reproducing it. Your mouth and your ears are working together, you're training your accent, your intonation, your rhythm. And all of these elements contribute to how naturally you sound when you speak. Shadowing also helps you absorb natural language patterns without consciously thinking about grammar rules. Your brain is just absorbing how the language flows. I would recommend doing shadowing practice for about 5 to 10 minutes every day if possible. Choose authentic English content that interests you. It could be a podcast, a YouTube video, a TED Talk, a movie. Pause frequently and repeat what you hear. Don't worry if you don't match the speaker perfectly. The act of trying is what matters. Your brain is learning. The fifth strategy is storytelling and narrative practice. Now, I know storytelling might seem like it's only relevant if you're in creative fields or you're a natural raconteur, but that's not true at all. Storytelling is actually a fundamental way that humans communicate. We communicate through stories. And practicing storytelling is an amazing way to develop fluency because it requires you to use language in a connected, flowing way. When you tell a story, you're not just saying random sentences. You're connecting events, describing causes and effects, sequencing actions, expressing emotions, building suspense, or humor. All of these elements require language skills, and practicing them builds your overall ability to communicate. So I started making a habit of telling myself stories about my day. Let me give you some real, concrete examples of how these strategies play out in actual situations, because I think examples really help bring everything into focus. Let me start by walking you through a day in my life and how I use these techniques practically. I wake up in the morning, and before I even get out of bed, I'm narrating my experience. I'm thinking, I'm waking up now, it's early morning, the light is just starting to come through the windows, I can hear birds singing outside, I'm stretching my arms and legs, my body feels rested. I'm thinking about what I need to do today. This internal narration might only take a minute or two, but it's setting the tone for the day. My brain is already warmed up and thinking in English. When I go to the kitchen to make breakfast, I continue narrating. I'm opening the cupboard. I'm looking for my favorite mug. I'm filling it with water. I'm putting it in the microwave to heat the water. While I'm waiting, I'm taking out a tea bag. I'm thinking about what I want to eat. I'm deciding between oatmeal and eggs. This narration is so automatic for me now that I don't even realize I'm doing it most of the time. Then I might listen to a podcast while I'm eating breakfast. I'm doing active listening. I'm paying attention to how the speaker is pronouncing words, how they're constructing sentences, how they're using connecting words. Maybe I'll pause occasionally and repeat something the speaker said, practicing the intonation. Later in the day, if I have a meeting or a presentation, I've already done my situational preparation. I know what I'm going to say in the beginning. I've thought through potential questions. I've prepared my key phrases. So when I walk into the meeting, I'm confident. I'm focused on the content and the connection with the people in the room, not on scrambling to figure out what to say. In the evening, I might spend some time reflecting on my day and telling myself the story of what happened. Today was a productive day. I woke up early and had a good breakfast. I spent the morning working on an important project. The work went well, and I'm feeling satisfied with my progress. Then I had a meeting with my team. We discussed some challenging problems, but I felt confident contributing to the conversation. After work, I came home and spent some time on hobbies that I enjoy. It was a good day overall. This kind of daily storytelling helps me practice using past tense, descriptive language, and emotional expression. It also helps me reflect on my communication successes and challenges. If there were moments where I struggled to find the right words or express myself clearly, thinking about them in the evening helps me process those experiences and prepare better for next time. Let me also give you an example of situational preparation that really paid off for me. Several years ago, I knew I would be interviewing for a job that required strong communication skills in English. This wasn't just any job interview. It was a job I really wanted, and I knew there would be some challenging questions. So I started preparing months in advance. I researched the company extensively. I thought about what they might ask me about. I prepared my answers, but I didn't just prepare the content, I also prepared my introduction. I practiced saying something like, "Hello, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today. I'm really excited about this opportunity because of specific reason. I'm confident that my experience and skills align well with what you're looking for." I thought about the typical interview questions. Tell me about yourself. Why do you want this job? What are your strengths and weaknesses? How do you handle challenges? For each of these, I prepared a thoughtful answer. I wrote them down, I read them aloud, I practiced them until they felt natural rather than scripted. I even prepared answers to more challenging questions, like, tell me about a time you failed. What did you learn? When I walked into that interview, I was nervous, which is normal, but I wasn't scrambling for words. I knew what I wanted to say. I had practiced my phrases. I had done the thinking ahead of time. And that preparation gave me the confidence to be myself in that room. I was able to listen carefully to the interviewer, to think about their questions, to give thoughtful answers. I got the job. Now, that's not to say that every single time you prepare, you'll get the outcome you want, but preparation definitely increases your chances of success. And more importantly, it gives you confidence. It gives you a sense that you're ready. And that sense of readiness is something that other people can perceive and respond to. It makes a difference. Let me give you another example. I used to be really nervous about making phone calls in English. Phone calls are uniquely challenging because you don't have the visual cues that you have in face-to-face conversations. You can't read someone's body language or facial expression. You have to rely entirely on tone of voice and words. Because of this, I found phone calls particularly stressful. So I started using situational preparation specifically for phone calls. If I knew I needed to make a call, I would prepare ahead of time. Let's say I needed to call a restaurant to make a reservation. I would think through what I might say. Hello, I would like to make a reservation for 4 people for this Saturday at 7 p.m. Do you have availability? I would think about what they might ask. What name should I put it under? What time works best for your party? Do you have any dietary restrictions we should know about? And I would think about how I would answer those questions. This preparation might take 10 minutes, but it would make the actual phone call so much less stressful. I would call with confidence. I would know what to expect and how to respond. And invariably, the call would go smoothly. That success would reinforce my confidence, and the next time I needed to make a phone call, I'd feel a little bit less nervous. Over time, through repeated, successful phone calls, I stopped being nervous about phone calls at all. Now I can call a restaurant or a business or someone I don't know very well, and I'm not anxious. I can be present in the conversation. I can listen and respond naturally. But that development happened because I prepared and practiced and gave myself confidence through successful experiences. Now, I want to talk about some of the obstacles that people commonly face when they're trying to improve their communication and build their confidence, because I think it's important to acknowledge that this journey isn't always smooth. There will be challenges and frustrations and moments where you want to give up. But if you're aware of these challenges ahead of time, you're better equipped to handle them when they arise. The first common obstacle is perfectionism. So many people, especially high achievers, get stuck because they have unrealistic expectations about how well they should communicate. They want every sentence to be grammatically perfect. They want every word to be precisely the right word. They want to sound exactly like a native speaker. And because they can't achieve that level of perfection, they become frustrated and discouraged. Here's what I want to say about perfectionism. It's a trap. Perfect is not a realistic goal. Perfect is not even a useful goal, because communication is not primarily about being perfect. Communication is about being understood. It's about conveying your ideas and connecting with other people. You don't need perfect grammar to do that. You don't need to sound exactly like a native speaker. You need to be clear, authentic, and engaged. When I let go of perfectionism, everything changed. I gave myself permission to make mistakes. I gave myself permission to not know a word. I gave myself permission to pause and think. And with that permission came freedom. I was actually able to communicate more effectively because I wasn't tying myself in knots trying to be perfect. The second common obstacle is comparing yourself to others. Maybe you listen to someone else speaking fluently and you think, I'll never be that good. Maybe you see someone else progress quickly and you feel discouraged about your own progress. Maybe you're in a class or a group with people who seem more advanced than you, and that makes you feel insecure. But here's the thing. Everyone's journey is different. Everyone comes to language learning with different backgrounds, different aptitudes, different amounts of time to dedicate to practice, different types of learning environments, different amounts of exposure to the language. You can't meaningfully compare your Chapter 3 to someone else's Chapter 10. It doesn't make sense. Your only real comparison should be to your own previous self. I try to measure my progress not by comparing myself to others, but by noticing improvements in my own ability. Can I understand this podcast better than I could a year ago? Can I express my ideas more clearly than I could 6 months ago? Did I feel less nervous in this conversation than I would have felt 2 years ago? These are the measures that matter. The third common obstacle is inconsistency. People often start strong. They're excited, they're motivated, they practice diligently. But then life gets busy. Work demands attention, family needs come up, other priorities emerge, and the language practice falls away. Weeks or months go by with minimal practice, and people feel like they've lost ground. The reality is that language development requires consistency. It doesn't require perfection. You don't need to practice for 3 hours every day, but you do need to practice regularly. 5 minutes every day is more effective than 2 hours once a week. Consistency builds neural pathways. Inconsistency tears them down. When I recommitted to improving my communication skills, I decided that I would do something every single day, even if it was just 5 minutes. Some days it was more, some days it was less. But I did something. I narrated my morning, I listened to a podcast, I had a conversation, I repeated some phrases, something. And that consistency, that daily commitment, made all the difference. The fourth common obstacle is fear of judgment. People worry about what others will think if they make a mistake. They worry about looking foolish or incompetent. They worry about being judged negatively. And because of these fears, they don't take the risks that are necessary for growth. They stay silent when they could be speaking. They avoid conversations that would stretch them. But here's something I've learned. Most people are far more focused on themselves than they are on judging you. Most people are so caught up in their own worries and insecurities that they're not sitting around evaluating whether you made a grammatical error. And the people who do notice small mistakes, most of them are kind and understanding. Most people remember what it felt like to be learning and struggling. I had to actively work on overcoming my fear of judgment. I had to give myself permission to be imperfect. I had to remind myself that making mistakes was not failure, it was learning. And the more times I put myself out there despite my fear, the less powerful that fear became. My brain realized that the bad thing I was worried about didn't actually happen, and gradually the fear diminished. The fifth common obstacle is lack of clear direction or purpose. Sometimes people want to improve their communication, but they don't have a clear sense of why they want to improve it or what success looks like. Without that clarity, it's hard to stay motivated. It's hard to know whether you're making progress. It's hard to choose which strategies to focus on. For me, I found that when I connected my communication goals to something larger that I cared about, the motivation increased dramatically. I wasn't just learning English to learn English. I was learning English because I wanted to have more opportunities in my career, because I wanted to be able to connect with people from different cultures, because I wanted to feel confident and capable in any situation. Those larger purposes made the daily practice feel meaningful. One of the most important things I've learned is that once you start making progress, you need to be intentional about maintaining and building on that progress. It's not enough to just implement some strategies and hope they stick. You need to actively tend to your growth, reflect on your progress, celebrate your wins, and adjust your approach as needed. The first element of sustaining progress is tracking what you're doing and noticing the results. I found it incredibly helpful to keep a simple journal where I record my communication practice and any observations about how things are going. This doesn't need to be elaborate. It can be just a few notes every day. What did I practice? How did it feel? Did I notice any improvement or any particular challenge? Over time, these notes create a record of your journey. When you're feeling discouraged, you can look back and see how far you've come. You can see patterns in what works for you and what doesn't. You can celebrate specific successes. I remember looking back at my journal from a year previous and being amazed at how much more confident I felt, how much more clearly I could express myself, how much less anxiety I experienced around communication. The second element is creating accountability. We all know that we're more likely to follow through on goals when someone else is involved and knows about those goals. This might mean finding a language exchange partner, joining a class or group, telling friends about your goals, or hiring a coach or tutor. When you know that someone else is expecting you to show up and put in effort, you're more likely to actually do it. For me, I've found that having people I can practice with on a regular basis has been invaluable. Even just knowing that I have a conversation partner waiting for me on Tuesday afternoon makes me more likely to practice during the week, so I feel prepared for that conversation. And the conversation itself is an opportunity to test out the things I've been working on and get real-time feedback. The third element is diversifying your practice. Doing the same thing every single day can get monotonous. It can start to feel stale. So I found it helpful to mix up my practice. Some days I focus on listening. Some days I focus on speaking. Some days I focus on writing. Some days I do shadowing practice. Some days I have a conversation with someone. This variety keeps things fresh and interesting, and it also ensures that you're developing multiple communication skills rather than just one. The fourth element is pushing yourself slightly beyond your comfort zone. We grow when we're challenged, but not so challenged that we're overwhelmed. I've learned to find that sweet spot where something feels a little bit difficult, but still achievable. Maybe I listen to a podcast that uses slightly more advanced vocabulary than I'm completely comfortable with. Maybe I have a conversation about a topic I haven't practiced before. Maybe I try to tell a story in past tense when I'm still more comfortable with present tense. This gentle pushing helps me expand my capabilities over time. The fifth element is celebrating your wins, no matter how small. I think this is really important because growth in communication is often gradual, and it can be easy to overlook progress if you're always looking for the next thing to improve. But if you take time to notice and celebrate the wins, the gains that you've made, you build positive momentum and reinforce the behaviors that are leading to improvement. For example, I remember the day when I realized I had made it through an entire conversation without consciously translating in my head. My brain was just working in English. That's a moment I celebrated. I also remember the first time I was in a professional meeting and I contributed to the discussion without feeling nervous. I noticed that. I celebrated it. These moments of noticing and celebrating are powerful. They create positive reinforcement, and they help you see yourself as capable and confident. Now, I want to shift our focus to something that I think is absolutely critical, but often gets overlooked when people talk about improving communication: listening skills. Because communication is not just about expressing yourself. It's at least 50% about understanding and responding to others. And to do that well, you need to be a skilled listener. Listening is not passive. Listening is not just hearing sound waves and processing them vaguely. Active listening is engaged, focused, intentional. It's listening with the goal of understanding what the other person is trying to communicate, not just waiting for your turn to speak. And developing this skill has profound effects on your overall communication ability. When I was working on becoming a more confident communicator, I realized that some of my anxiety came from not understanding people clearly. If I wasn't sure what someone had said, or if I didn't fully understand what they were asking, I would become anxious. My mind would be racing, trying to figure out what was being said, rather than being present in the conversation. Once I started focusing on developing strong listening skills, a lot of that anxiety went away. The first aspect of active listening is paying full attention. This means putting away distractions. It means looking at the person if possible, or if not, at least not distracted by other things. It means focusing your mind on what they're saying, rather than thinking about what you're going to say next or letting your mind wander. It's surprisingly difficult to do this consistently, but it's incredibly powerful. I've noticed that when I really pay full attention to what someone is saying, they respond positively. They feel heard, they're more likely to continue the conversation, they're more likely to want to engage with me. And for me, paying full attention also means I'm more likely to understand what they're saying, which means I'm more confident and less anxious in the conversation. The second aspect of active listening is listening for understanding, not just for information. This means trying to understand not just what the words are, but what the person is trying to communicate. What are they feeling? What's their underlying message? What matters to them about this? When you listen for understanding rather than just hearing words, you have more context for how to respond. You can respond more thoughtfully and authentically. For example, if someone says, "I'm so frustrated with my job," you could hear that as just a statement of fact. But if you listen for understanding, you might realize that what they're really expressing is a need for change, or support, or validation. And that deeper understanding allows you to respond more meaningfully. Rather than just saying, "Oh, that's unfortunate," you might say, "That sounds really difficult. What's been the most frustrating part?" And suddenly, you're having a real conversation where the other person feels understood. The third aspect of active listening is noticing patterns and structures in how people communicate. As you listen to more and more English, your brain will start to absorb patterns about how the language works. You'll notice the ways people start sentences. You'll notice the words they use to connect ideas. You'll notice how they express emotions or opinions. You'll notice how they recover when they make mistakes. All of this is useful information that helps you develop your own communication skills. I make a conscious effort to pay attention to these patterns. When I'm listening to a podcast or watching a video, I'm not just following the content. I'm also listening to how the speaker constructs their sentences, how they use pauses, how they use emphasis, how they use connecting words. Sometimes I'll pause and try to repeat something the speaker said, not just for pronunciation practice, but to understand better how the sentence is structured. The fourth aspect of active listening is asking clarifying questions when you don't understand something. This is huge, and it took me a while to feel comfortable doing this. I used to be embarrassed to ask someone to repeat something or to explain something I didn't understand. But I've learned that asking for clarification is actually a sign of good communication. It shows that you're engaged and that you want to understand. Most people are happy to clarify. I've developed a few ways of asking for clarification that feel natural to me. Could you say that again? I'm not sure I understood. Did you mean? Could you give me an example? What do you mean by that? These are simple, straightforward ways of asking for clarification without making it awkward or making the other person feel bad about not being clear. The fifth aspect of active listening is remembering key information from what someone says. When you listen carefully, you're more likely to remember details about what was said. And when you remember details and reference them later, the other person feels truly heard. They feel like you were paying attention. This builds connection and trust in the relationship. I found that sometimes I need to take notes to remember key information, especially in professional contexts or when someone is sharing something important. But even in casual conversations, I try to pay attention to important details so I can reference them later. It makes such a difference in how people respond to you when they realize you were really listening and you remember what they said. As I've progressed in my own communication journey, I've come to appreciate the power of reflection and self-awareness. It's one thing to practice communication skills. It's another thing to reflect on what you're doing, how it's working, what you might do differently. This reflection is what turns practice into learning and growth. I've developed a practice of regular reflection that has been really valuable for me. Once a week, usually on Sunday evening, I spend about 15 or 20 minutes thinking about my communication over the past week. I ask myself, what conversations did I have? How did they go? Were there moments where I felt confident and moments where I felt less confident? What skills did I use successfully? What challenges did I encounter? What did I learn? This reflection doesn't need to be elaborate. I'm not writing long essays or anything like that. I'm just asking myself these questions and thinking about the answers. And invariably, I notice patterns. Maybe I realized that I felt most confident in conversations where I had done some preparation ahead of time. That reinforces the value of preparation. Maybe I notice that when I'm stressed or tired, my communication is less fluent. That helps me understand what factors affect my performance. Over time, through consistent reflection, I've developed quite a bit of self-awareness about my communication patterns. I know that I communicate better when I'm well-rested. I know that I feel more confident in written communication than in spontaneous verbal communication, and I know that's something I can practice. I know that I sometimes rush when I'm nervous, and I can consciously slow down as a response to that. I know that I communicate best when I'm genuinely interested in the topic and in the other person. Yourself, you can make choices based on that knowledge. If you know that you communicate better when you're well-rested, you can prioritize sleep when you have an important conversation coming up. If you know that you rush when you're nervous, you can consciously practice slowing down. If you know that you communicate best when you're interested, you can try to find something about every conversation that genuinely interests you. Another aspect of reflection is noticing your self-talk and the beliefs you have about your communication abilities. Our beliefs about ourselves are incredibly powerful. If you believe you're bad at public speaking, you'll probably be bad at public speaking, not because you lack ability, but because you're so anxious that it interferes with your performance. If you believe you're good at one-on-one conversations, you'll probably be good at them because you approach them with confidence and ease. I've worked on identifying the limiting beliefs I have about my communication and questioning them. For example, I used to have a belief that I wasn't a naturally good communicator. I had to work harder than other people at it, and that belief made me feel deficient in some way. But then I realized that the fact that I have to work hard at it doesn't mean I'm not good at it. In fact, probably everyone who's really good at communication has had to work at it. That's how you become good at anything. You practice, you work at it. Once I reframed my belief from, I have to work harder than others, which means I'm deficient, to, I have to work at this, which is how I'll become skilled, everything changed. The hard work became something I was doing by choice, something that would lead to improvement, rather than something I had to do because I was lacking in some way. And paradoxically, once I adopted this more empowering belief, the work felt less hard. It felt purposeful. Now, I want to talk about something important. Communication looks different in different contexts. The way you communicate in a job interview is probably not the same as the way you communicate with a close friend. The way you communicate in a professional presentation is different from the way you communicate in a casual conversation. The way you communicate in writing is different from the way you communicate verbally. And being aware of these differences is important for developing well-rounded communication skills. Let me talk about professional communication first, since that's a context where many people feel pressure to communicate very carefully and correctly. In professional settings, communication is often more formal. There are certain expectations about how people should talk. There's an emphasis on clarity, concision, and professionalism. For a long time, I found professional communication quite stressful because I worried so much about being correct. But I've learned that professional communication doesn't need to be stiff or unnatural. Effective professional communicators are often people who are clear, genuine, and personable. They communicate with authority and knowledge, but they also communicate in a way that feels human and authentic. So when I'm preparing for professional communication, I focus on being clear and being myself, rather than trying to be perfect or formal. I've also learned that in professional contexts, it's actually okay to use some of the phrases that help you buy time and think. Saying, "That's an interesting question. Let me think about that for a moment," is not weakness. It's actually a sign of thoughtful communication. Saying, "I'm not entirely certain about that, but based on what I know," is not a problem. It's honest and it's clear. Let me contrast that with casual social communication, which is a very different animal. In casual social communication, the goal is connection and comfort. It's okay to be less formal, to use contractions, to use more casual vocabulary, to joke around, to tell stories about your life. This kind of communication is less about being correct and more about being engaging and authentic. The interesting thing is that I actually had to learn this. I spent so much time worrying about being correct that when I was in casual social situations, I was still being overly formal and careful. My close friends would actually tell me, "You sound like a textbook. Just talk normally." And I had to loosen up, to be more natural, to have fun with language. Once I did, I enjoyed social interactions so much more. Professional written communication is another distinct context. Email, reports, formal letters. This is where clarity and concision are really important. In written communication, you don't have the benefit of body language or tone of voice to help you communicate your meaning. So you need to be especially clear about what you're saying. You need to organize your thoughts in a way that's easy to follow. I've learned that in professional written communication, it helps to have a clear structure. I usually start with the main point. I follow with supporting details or explanations. I end with what I'm asking for or what I want the reader to do. This structure makes it easy for the reader to understand what I'm communicating, and the clearer I can be, the better. Social written communication is different. Text messages, emails to friends, social media. This is where you can be more casual and colloquial. You can use abbreviations and emoji. You can be more playful and less formal. The rules are much looser. And honestly, this is often where I feel most comfortable communicating because there's less pressure for it to be perfect. Spoken communication in presentations or public speaking is another distinct context. This is where you're speaking to a group of people, usually for an extended period of time. You need to think about things like pacing, variety, engagement, clarity. You need to think about how to structure your ideas so that they flow well and are easy to follow. You need to think about using stories and examples to illustrate your points and keep people engaged. I used to find presentations very stressful, but I've learned that they're actually one of my favorite contexts to communicate in because there's time to prepare. You can know exactly what you're going to say, you can practice it, you can anticipate what people might ask, and if you've prepared well, you can be quite confident. I also find that I can infuse presentations with my personality and passion for the topic, which makes them more engaging. Spontaneous one-on-one conversation is perhaps the most variable context because you don't know what's going to be said, you don't have time to prepare responses, you need to think on your feet. This is the context where all of those strategies I've been talking about really come into play. Your ability to think clearly, to listen well, to access useful phrases, to recover if you're unsure of something, to stay calm under pressure. All of that shows up in spontaneous conversation. What I've realized is that the skills overlap. If you can communicate effectively in one context, you can generally communicate effectively in other contexts, but you might need to adjust your style slightly. You might need to be more formal in one context and more casual in another. You might need to be more concise in written communication and more expansive in casual social communication. But the underlying skills are the same: clarity, authenticity, engagement, listening. I want to talk about the role that technology can play in helping you develop your communication skills. There are so many amazing tools available now, and I've found several that have been genuinely helpful in my own development. First, there are apps and software designed specifically for language learning. Duolingo, Babbel, Rosetta Stone. These can be helpful, especially for building basic vocabulary and grammar foundations. I've used these, and I think they're valuable, especially if you're just starting out. But I also think they're limited. They tend to be quite structured and artificial. The language you're learning is often not how people actually speak. So while they can be useful as part of your toolkit, I wouldn't rely on them exclusively. Podcasts and audio content are incredibly valuable for listening practice and exposure to natural language. I listen to podcasts on a wide variety of topics, and this is one of my favorite ways to practice. You can listen to podcasts while you're doing other things, and you get exposure to authentic language spoken by native speakers. Plus, you're learning about topics that interest you, so there's a double benefit. YouTube is another incredible resource. There's YouTube content on literally every topic you can imagine, and you can find content at different levels of difficulty. You can watch videos about things that interest you, and as a secondary benefit, you're improving your listening and communication skills. I do a lot of shadowing practice with YouTube videos. Online language exchange platforms connect you with other language learners or native speakers who want to practice. Apps like Tandem or Conversation Exchange allow you to find exchange partners and have conversations by text or video. This is valuable because you get to practice in a real conversation, but with someone who understands that you're learning. The stakes feel lower than they might in some other contexts. Recording yourself and listening back is something I've found really helpful. When you record yourself and listen, you get to hear how you actually sound. You notice things like your pace, your intonation, any recurring filler words, your pronunciation, the clarity of your communication. This self-awareness is valuable. You get to hear yourself as other people hear you, which can be eye-opening. Social media can also be a tool for communication practice, though you have to be intentional about it. Commenting on posts in English, writing posts in English, engaging in discussions. All of this is communication practice, and it can feel lower stakes than some other forms of communication because you have time to compose your thoughts. Transcription services can be helpful if you want to practice writing. You can record yourself speaking and then transcribe what you said. This helps you see the difference between how you think you're speaking and how you're actually speaking. It's another form of that valuable self-awareness. The key with all of these tools is to use them intentionally. Don't just passively use them. When you're using language learning apps, pay attention to what you're learning. When you're listening to podcasts, do active listening. When you're using language exchange platforms, be fully present in the conversation. When you record yourself, actually listen and reflect. It's the intentionality that makes the difference. I think it would be remiss of me not to talk explicitly about communication anxiety and how to work with it, because it's something that so many people deal with, and I've dealt with it myself. There are times, even now, when I feel nervous before an important communication situation, but I've learned how to work with that anxiety rather than being controlled by it. First, let me normalize anxiety around communication. It's not a character flaw. It's not a sign that you shouldn't be communicating. Anxiety around communication is incredibly common, even among native speakers. Some of the most accomplished communicators I know have told me that they still get nervous before presentations or important conversations. The difference is that they've learned to feel the anxiety and do the thing anyway. Anxiety is fundamentally a fear response. Your brain perceives a threat and it triggers your fight, flight, freeze response. In the context of communication, the perceived threat might be judgment from others, making a mistake, not being understood, losing face in some way. Once you understand that anxiety is just your brain trying to protect you, you can work with it more effectively. One technique I found helpful is what's called cognitive reframing. This is where you notice the anxious thought you're having and you consciously reframe it in a more productive way. For example, if I'm feeling anxious and I notice myself thinking, what if I make a mistake? Everyone will judge me. I consciously reframe that thought to something like, I might make a small mistake, and that's okay. Most people won't care or won't even notice. And if I do make a mistake, I'll learn from it. Another technique is what's called exposure therapy or gradual exposure. This is where you expose yourself to the thing you're anxious about, starting with a small version and gradually working up to larger versions. So if you're anxious about speaking English, you might start by speaking English to yourself or to a very close friend, then to a small group of friends, then to a larger group, then in professional settings. Each time you successfully communicate despite feeling anxious, your brain learns that the feared outcome doesn't actually happen. The anxiety gradually decreases. I've also learned the importance of physical self-care for managing anxiety. When I'm well-rested, well-fed, and physically healthy, I'm much more resilient to anxiety. When I'm sleep-deprived, stressed, and not taking care of myself physically, anxiety is much more powerful. So managing anxiety includes managing the basics of self-care. Breathing techniques can be helpful for managing the physical symptoms of anxiety. When you're anxious, your breathing often becomes shallow and rapid. This actually increases your anxiety. But if you consciously slow your breathing and make it deeper, it signals to your nervous system that you're safe. A simple technique is to breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, and breathe out for 4 counts. Just doing this a few times can calm your nervous system significantly. Another strategy is to build resilience by intentionally putting yourself in situations that stretch you. When you consistently do things that are a little bit scary or challenging, you build confidence in your ability to handle difficult situations. You prove to yourself that you can do hard things. This resilience carries over to communication. If you've challenged yourself in other areas of your life, you're more likely to believe that you can challenge yourself in communication as well. I also think it's helpful to develop a growth mindset around communication anxiety specifically. This is the belief that your ability to communicate confidently is not fixed. It can grow. It can improve. If you believe that your current anxiety level is just where you happen to be right now, but that it can change, that's very different from believing that this is just how you are and it can't change. One of the things that's been most rewarding about improving my communication skills is how it's allowed me to build deeper, more genuine connections with people. Because communication is really the foundation of all human connection. And when you can communicate effectively, you can connect more deeply. I think one of the keys to building genuine connections through communication is authenticity. This means not trying to be someone you're not trying to sound like a native speaker if you're not pretending to know things you don't know, not hiding your thoughts and feelings because you're worried about how you'll be perceived, just being genuinely yourself. When I was anxious about communication, I often tried to be very careful and precise. I thought that would make me seem more competent or intelligent. But what it actually did was make me seem stiff and inauthentic. People couldn't really connect with me because I wasn't showing them who I really was. Once I decided to be more authentic, to let my personality come through, to be willing to be less polished, people responded to me differently. They warmed up to me. They wanted to continue conversations with me. Another key to building genuine connections is showing genuine interest in others. When you're genuinely interested in someone, it shows. And people respond to that interest. They feel valued and seen. They open up more. They're more willing to engage. So I've made a practice of being genuinely curious about people. I ask questions, not because I'm following some formula for good conversation, but because I'm actually interested in learning about them. I've also learned that vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness in communication. When you're willing to admit that you don't know something, or that you're not an expert, or that you're feeling nervous, that actually makes you more relatable and more human. It gives other people permission to be imperfect as well. It creates space for genuine connection rather than a transactional exchange. For example, if I'm in a situation where I don't understand something, rather than pretending I understand or getting flustered, I might say, "I'm not entirely sure I understood. Could you explain that again?" This admission of uncertainty actually builds trust and connection rather than damaging it. The other person appreciates my honesty. They feel like I'm being genuine with them. As we near the end of this conversation, I want to shift our focus toward the long term. Improving your communication is not a destination where you arrive and then you're done. It's an ongoing journey of growth and development. And I think it's valuable to think about what that long-term vision might look like for you. For me, my long-term vision around communication is to be able to express myself clearly, authentically, and confidently in any situation. I want to be able to have deep conversations with people from different backgrounds and cultures. I want to be able to speak and be understood. I want to be able to listen and understand others. I want my communication to be a vehicle for creating connection and positive impact in the world. That vision keeps me motivated to continue practicing and growing, even though I have already come quite far. I'm still pushing myself to expand my comfort zone. I'm still working on new skills. I'm still discovering new aspects of communication that I want to develop. One thing I've realized is that as you become more skilled at communication, you're able to take on more complex and challenging communication situations. Early on, I was focused on just basic understanding and expression. Now I'm thinking about things like persuasion, negotiation, conflict resolution, teaching others, inspiring people. These are more advanced communication skills, and pursuing them keeps me engaged and motivated. I want to encourage you to think about what your long-term vision is around communication. What does confident, authentic communication look like for you? What would be possible for you if you could communicate the way you want to? What impact would that have on your career, your relationships, your life? Getting clear on that vision can help you stay motivated when the daily practice feels challenging. I also want to emphasize that there's no finish line where you're completely done growing. Even the most skilled communicators I know are still learning and developing. Language continues to evolve, your life continues to change, and that means you're encountering new communication situations and challenges. The key is to embrace that ongoing growth rather than seeing it as a deficit. Now, let me give you some specific exercises and activities that you can start doing right now to develop your communication skills. I want these to be practical and actionable, so you can literally start today if you want to. The first exercise is the Daily Narration Challenge. Every day for the next week, pick one activity that you do regularly and narrate it to yourself in complete sentences. It could be your morning routine, your commute, your lunch break, your evening wind down. Describe what you're seeing, what you're doing, what you're feeling. Do this out loud if you can, or silently if you need to. The goal is to train your brain to think directly in English about your experiences. The second exercise is the phrase banking activity. Over the next week, listen to podcasts, watch videos, or read articles, and identify phrases or sentence structures that you find useful or interesting. Write them down or keep a note on your phone. Collect at least 20 to 30 phrases. Then practice using these phrases in your own sentences. See how many different contexts you can use each phrase in. The third exercise is the conversation rehearsal. Think of a conversation that's coming up in your life, something you're nervous about or that you want to go well. It could be a job interview, a difficult conversation with someone, a presentation, a phone call, whatever. Write down the key points you want to communicate. Think about questions you might be asked and how you would answer. Practice saying what you want to say out loud until it feels natural rather than scripted. The fourth exercise is the shadowing sprint. Choose a short piece of English content, maybe 3 to 5 minutes. Listen to it once and understand the general meaning. Then, listen again and try to repeat what you hear immediately after the speaker says it, matching the pronunciation and intonation as closely as possible. Do this repeatedly until you can shadow the entire clip smoothly. The fifth exercise is the storytelling journal. For the next week, each evening, write or record a short story about your day. Start with how your day began, move through the key events, and end with how you felt about your day. Use complete sentences, use connecting words, use a variety of tenses. Then read what you've written out loud or listen to what you've recorded. Notice how it sounds. Notice what you could improve. The sixth exercise is the active listening practice. The next time you're having a conversation with someone, focus entirely on listening. Try not to think about what you're going to say next. Just listen. Notice how they construct their sentences. Notice what words they use. Notice their tone and pace. Try to absorb how they're communicating. After the conversation, reflect on what you noticed. I want to bring our conversation toward a close by talking about something that's really important, celebrating your progress. I think people often underestimate how important this is. When you're working on improving something about yourself, it's easy to focus on how far you still have to go. But if you don't celebrate how far you've come, you lose motivation and momentum. I make it a practice to regularly acknowledge the progress I've made. I think about conversations I used to find stressful that now feel easy. I think about words or phrases that are now part of my automatic vocabulary that I once had to consciously search for. I think about how my accent has improved, how my confidence has grown, how my comfort with spontaneous communication has expanded. These reflections feel good, and they reinforce my commitment to continued growth. I also celebrate small wins in real time. If I have a conversation that goes well, I acknowledge that. If I successfully use a new phrase or expression, I notice and appreciate that. If I successfully navigate a communication situation that would have made me nervous in the past, I acknowledge the progress. These small celebrations create positive momentum. I also want to encourage you to notice and celebrate the ways that your improved communication is creating changes in other areas of your life. Maybe you're having deeper conversations with friends. Maybe you're feeling more confident at work. Maybe you're having new opportunities because you can communicate more effectively. Maybe you're connecting with people from different backgrounds. These downstream effects are the real measure of progress, and they're worth celebrating. As you move forward in your communication journey, I want you to remember a few key things. First, consistency matters more than intensity. Regular, daily practice is more effective than sporadic, intense effort. Second, you learn best when you're engaged and interested. Choose communication topics and activities that genuinely interest you. Third, mistakes are learning opportunities, not failures. Embrace the learning that comes from making mistakes. Fourth, comparison is the thief of joy. Focus on your own progress, not on comparing yourself to others. Fifth, authenticity matters. Let your genuine self come through in your communication. Before we wrap up, I want to address some specific challenges that people often mention to me when we talk about communication. Let me give you some thoughts on how to work with these. First, the challenge of accent and pronunciation. A lot of people worry that they'll never sound like a native speaker or that their accent will always be noticeable. My honest take on this is that's probably true, and that's okay. Most people who've learned a language as adults will have an accent of some kind. And you know what? That's fine. What matters is that you're understood. If your communication is clear and your message comes across, a slight accent is not a problem. That said, if you want to improve your pronunciation and accent, consistent shadowing practice really does help. Just don't make perfect pronunciation your ultimate goal. Second, the challenge of vocabulary gaps. You're in a conversation and you realize you don't know a word you need, so you either stay silent or you try to explain what you mean. My recommendation is to practice the second option. Get comfortable explaining or describing things in different ways. Sometimes this leads to more interesting and creative communication anyway. You're not limited by the single word you don't know. You can find alternative ways to express what you're trying to say. Third, the challenge of conversational speed and flow. Other people are talking fast, and you're struggling to keep up or formulate responses quickly. My suggestion is to practice with slightly faster content than you're comfortable with. This gradually expands your processing speed. Also, remember that pauses are okay. You don't need to respond immediately. It's fine to take a moment to collect your thoughts. This creates better communication anyway. Fourth, the challenge of cultural differences in communication. Different cultures have different communication norms. What's considered appropriate or polite in one culture might be seen differently in another. My suggestion is to be aware of these differences and to be willing to ask about them. I'm not sure what the expectation is here. What would be appropriate is a perfectly valid question. Most people appreciate your willingness to understand and respect their communication norms. Fifth, the challenge of professional communication. Professional contexts often feel high stakes and formal. My suggestion is to be clear and professional, but also authentic. You don't need to be stiff or formal. You can be warm and personable while still being professional. Also, remember that most of your professional communication is about ideas and information and connection, not about perfect grammar or sounding like a native speaker. As we move toward the end of this episode, I want to share some final reflections and thoughts that I hope will stay with you. The journey of improving your communication is not just about becoming better at speaking or understanding a language. It's about becoming more fully yourself. Because when you can communicate effectively, you can express your thoughts, your feelings, your ideas, your creativity. You can connect with others. You can contribute to conversations and to the world around you. You can be seen and understood. I think back to where I was years ago, struggling with communication, feeling anxious and uncertain, and I think about where I am now, able to express myself, able to connect with people, able to navigate communication situations with confidence. That transformation has affected every area of my life. It's opened doors, created opportunities, deepened relationships, expanded my sense of what's possible for me. And I believe that the same is possible for you. I believe that with consistent practice, with the right strategies, with a focus on authentic communication rather than perfect communication, you can develop your communication skills and your confidence significantly. It takes time and effort, but it's absolutely possible. I also want to acknowledge that this journey is not always easy. There will be moments where you feel frustrated. There will be moments where you wonder if you're making progress. There will be moments where you're tired of practicing and you want to give up. In those moments, I want you to remember why you started. Remember what's possible for you when you can communicate effectively. Remember that every single person who's skilled at communication has been where you are. They felt uncertain and nervous and frustrated, and they pushed through. One more thing I want to say. Be kind to yourself. The inner voice that criticizes you for making mistakes or not being perfect yet, that voice is not your friend. That voice is your fear speaking, but it's not the truth. The truth is that you're working on developing an important skill. You're pushing yourself. You're being brave. That's worthy of celebration and compassion, not criticism. As you continue on your communication journey, I hope you'll remember this conversation. I hope you'll return to some of these strategies and exercises when you need them. I hope you'll celebrate your progress. And I hope you'll stay committed to becoming the communicator you want to be, because I genuinely believe that's possible for you. Thank you so much for being with me through this long conversation. Thank you for giving your time and your attention. I know that listening to a long episode like this requires commitment. I appreciate that you've made that commitment, and I hope that this episode has given you something valuable. I'm Lily, and this has been an episode on building confidence in communication. If this conversation resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to reach out, share your thoughts, let me know what you found most helpful or what questions came up for you. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd be grateful if you would share it with someone you think might benefit from these ideas. Word of mouth is how podcasts grow, and I really appreciate when listeners share content that they found valuable. If you want to deepen your work on communication and confidence, I have several resources available. Check out my website or my social media for additional tools, exercises, and support. Most importantly, I hope you'll remember that improving your communication is a journey, not a destination. Be patient with yourself, celebrate your progress, stay committed to your growth, and know that you absolutely have the ability to become the communicator you want to be. I'll be back very soon with another episode. I'm already working on some really interesting topics that I think you'll enjoy. Until then, keep practicing, keep pushing yourself, keep being authentically you, and keep believing in your ability to grow and change. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.